Commander Zixthara stood on the bridge of his massive ship called Stellar Dominion and looked at the small blue planet ahead of him. His green-scaled skin reflected the light from the screens around him as he studied the world humans called Earth. For over 300 cycles, he had served the Velokian Empire and conquered 17 different worlds, but this one disgusted him more than any other he had seen before. The alien commander pressed a button, and images filled the air around, him showing what humans had done to their own world. Black smoke poured from tall towers into the sky, while giant machines cut down endless forests. Rivers ran dark with poison, and mountains of trash covered the land like ugly scars. Dead fish floated in poisoned seas, while the air itself burned. With chemicals that killed everything they touched, Zixthara made a sound of disgust deep in his throat. His own world of Velokar was a paradise of crystal cities that grew from living rock and forests that sang with perfect harmony. Every Velokian learned from birth to live as one with their environment, and their technology worked with nature instead of against it. They had never known war or pollution or the madness of destroying the very world that gave them life. But these humans were different, and that difference made them monsters in his eyes. They poisoned their own air and water, then kept breathing it and drinking it anyway. They cut down their forests, then complained about the weather changing. They killed their animals, then wondered why their world was dying. Zixthara had studied thousands of species across the galaxy, but he had never seen anything as stupid and self-destructive as humans. The communication officer turned toward him with respect. Her name was Silandra, and she had worked with Zixthara for many years. She pointed at the screen showing radio signals coming from Earth and spoke in the musical language of their people. "Commander, the humans are trying to contact us. Their leader wants to talk about peace." Zixthara laughed, but it was not a happy sound. It was cold and full of contempt for the creatures on the world below. He had read their history and seen their wars. Humans fought each other over everything from water to land to ideas while their world burned around them. They made weapons that could destroy their entire planet, then pointed them at each other like children playing with fire. "Peace," he said, and his voice carried all the disgust he felt. "These planet killers speak of peace while they murder their own world. Open a channel to all their ships and cities. I want every human to hear what I have to say." The bridge grew, quiet as Silandra worked at her controls. Soon every human communication device on Earth and in space would carry his words. Zixthara stood tall and let his contempt show clearly on his face as he began to speak in the human language called English. "Humans of Earth, I am Commander Zixthara of the Velokian Empire. For days I have watched your world and studied your history, and I am disgusted by what I have seen. You are not a civilization, but a plague that destroys everything it touches. You have poisoned your air until it burns your lungs. You have filled your waters with chemicals that kill your fish. You have turned your beautiful forests into dead wastelands and your mountains into garbage dumps." He paused and let his words sink in before continuing with even more anger in his voice. "In all my travels across this galaxy, I have never seen a species so stupid as to destroy the very world that gave them life. You fight wars over resources while wasting those same resources. You create weapons that could end all life on your planet, then threaten to use them on each other. You are ecological parasites that deserve nothing but death." On the screen, he could see human ships moving to intercept his fleet. Their leader was a man called Captain Jake Morrison, who commanded a ship named UEC Defender. The human vessels looked primitive and weak compared to Velokian technology, but Zixthara knew they would try to fight anyway. Humans always fought even when they had no chance of winning. Captain Morrison's face appeared on the communication screen. He was a middle-aged man with gray hair and determined eyes. His uniform was neat and clean, but Zixthara could see the fear hidden behind his brave expression. Commander Zixthara, I am Captain Jake Morrison of the United Earth Space Command. We welcome you to our solar system and hope we can discuss our differences peacefully. Earth has made mistakes in the past, but we are working to fix them. Zixthara laughed again, and the sound made several of his bridge crew uncomfortable. They had served with him long enough to know that laugh meant death for someone. Fix them, he repeated with mockery clear in his voice. You have had thousands of years to learn how to live on your world without destroying it, but instead you made it worse with each passing generation. You created poisons that will remain in your soil for centuries. You melted ice that will never freeze again. You killed species that will never return to life. The alien commander walked closer to the screen so Morrison could see his contempt. Clearly, your species is a disease, Captain Morrison, and the Valokian Empire has come to cure your world of that disease. We will cleanse Earth of its infection and restore it to the paradise it was meant to be. Your kind has proven that it cannot be trusted with the care of a living world. Morrison tried to speak, but Zixthara cut off the communication with a gesture. He turned to his weapons officer and gave the order that would begin the end of humanity. Target their lead ship, but do not destroy it. I want them to run back to their world and tell everyone what is coming. Let them spend their last days in fear, knowing they brought this upon themselves. The Stellar Dominion fired a single beam of energy that sliced through the human ship's shields like they were made of paper. The U.E.'s defenders shook and burned, but did not break apart. Morrison and his crew were still alive, but their ship was crippled and helpless. You have seen the power of the Valokian Empire. Zixthara broadcast to all the human ships. Return to your poisoned world and prepare for judgment. In 7 days my full fleet will arrive, and we will begin the purification of Earth. Those who created this ecological disaster will face the justice they deserve. The human ships turned and fled toward Earth, with their damaged leader limping behind them. Zixthara watched them go with satisfaction. Soon his people would arrive with the great atmosphere processors that could clean any world, no matter how badly it had been polluted. They would scrub Earth's air and water until it was pure again, then seed it with proper life forms that knew how to live in harmony. As for the humans themselves, they would be removed like any other pest. Zixthara felt no guilt about this decision. A species that destroyed its own world deserved no mercy from those who knew how to care for theirs. Earth would be beautiful again once the planet killers were gone and proper stewards took their place. The alien commander looked one last time at the blue world that would soon belong to his empire. In his mind, he could already see it as it would be, with crystal cities growing from healthy soil and clean rivers running through restored forests. It would be a paradise just like Velakar, and the ugly scars left by humanity would be healed forever. But first, the disease had to be cured, and Zixthara was ready to be the cure his empire needed. 3 months passed like a nightmare for everyone on Earth. The news of the alien ultimatum spread across every nation and every city, until panic filled the streets like floodwater. Captain Jake Morrison had returned from his encounter with Commander Zixthara, carrying a message that chilled the blood of every human who heard it. The aliens were coming to cleanse Earth, and they viewed humanity as nothing more than a disease to be cured. Dr. Lisa Barnes stood in the emergency meeting room deep beneath the Swiss mountains, where world leaders had gathered to plan humanity's defense. She was the head of Earth's Xenobiology Institute, and one of the few people who understood alien technology well enough to offer hope. Her brown hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail, and her tired eyes showed the strain of working without sleep for weeks. Around the table sat the most powerful people on Earth, but they all looked helpless in the face of what was coming. The President of the Americas sat next to the Premier of the Asian Federation, while the African Union representative argued with the European Chancellor about evacuation plans. But Dr. Barnes knew that running would not save them, because there was nowhere in the solar system that the Velokian fleet could not reach. Colonel Ryan Hayes entered the room wearing his military uniform with medals that showed his years of service in conflicts around the world. His job was to coordinate the defense of Earth, but everyone knew their weapons were primitive compared to what the aliens possessed. The brief battle in space had proven that human technology was centuries behind Velokian science. The enemy fleet has been detected at the edge of our solar system, he announced in a voice that stayed steady despite the terrible news he carried. Over 200 ships, including massive vessels, we believe are atmosphere processors. They will reach Earth in 72 hours, just as their commander promised. Dr. Barnes looked at the satellite images, showing the alien armada approaching like a storm cloud of death. Each ship was larger than Earth's biggest space stations, and they moved in perfect formation that spoke of military discipline beyond human understanding. But what worried her most were the huge cylindrical vessels at the center of the fleet that could only be the atmosphere processors Zixthara had threatened to use. What exactly do these processors do? Asked the president, and his voice shook slightly as he spoke. Dr. Barnes activated the holographic display and showed a simulation based on data they had gathered from the brief space battle. The images made everyone in the room go silent with horror. They are designed to completely change a planet's atmosphere and environment. The aliens will position them in orbit and begin filtering our air and water through their technology. Within months, they can turn Earth into a copy of their home world, with different gravity, different air pressure, and completely different chemistry. The European Chancellor leaned forward with fear clear on her face. What happens to us during this process? We, Dr. Barnes said, simply because there was no gentle way to explain extinction. Human life cannot survive the kind of atmosphere they will create. Neither can most of Earth's plants and animals. They will essentially terraform our world while we are still living on it, underground in the abandoned subway tunnels of New York City. 2 people worked frantically on humanity's only hope of survival. Tony Chun was an engineer who had spent his career designing systems that could work in hostile environments. Kate Miller was a biologist who specialized in extremophile organisms that lived in places where nothing else could survive. They had managed to salvage pieces of Velokian technology from the damaged alien probe that crashed in the Pacific Ocean during the first encounter. For weeks they had studied the strange bioneural circuits that seemed to blend technology with living tissue in ways human science had never imagined. Look at this, Kate said as she peered through her microscope at a sample of alien biomatter. Their technology is completely organic. It grows instead of being built, and it adapts to its environment like a living creature. Tony nodded as he examined the power systems that seemed to draw energy from biological processes rather than traditional fuel sources. But that might also be their weakness. Living systems can be poisoned or infected or made to malfunction if you know what you are doing. Above ground, the first alien ships entered Earth's atmosphere like falling stars that brought death instead of wishes. The sky filled with massive vessels that blotted out the sun as they took positions over major cities around the world. Commander Zixthara's flagship positioned itself directly above the ruins of what had once been the Amazon rainforest, as if to make a point about human environmental destruction. The atmosphere processors activated with a sound like thunder that rolled across continents. Giant machines descended from the alien ships and began their work of purification. They sucked in Earth's polluted air and released something cleaner but completely wrong for human lungs. The grass began to wither and die as the chemical balance of the atmosphere changed with each passing hour. In the underground command center, Dr. Barnes watched the global environmental readings with growing alarm. The alien machines were not just cleaning the air, but changing its very composition. Oxygen levels dropped, while strange gases that human instruments could not identify began to appear in the atmosphere. "They are turning our world into theirs," she whispered as the terrible truth became clear. "In months, the air itself will be poison to every living thing on Earth." Colonel Hayes coordinated the military response, but it was like fighting a hurricane with water pistols. Human missiles could not penetrate the alien shields, and their energy weapons bounced off Valokian armor like raindrops. The few fighter pilots brave enough to attack the massive ships simply vanished in flashes of light that left no trace behind. But the aliens made no effort to hunt down the humans who fled into underground shelters and abandoned buildings. Commander Zixthara seemed content to let the atmosphere processors do their work while his ground forces secured key locations around the planet. To him, humans were already dead and just did not know it yet. In the deep tunnels beneath London, Kate Miller made a discovery that changed everything. She had been studying samples of Earth's most polluted soil and water, looking for organisms that might survive the alien purification process. What she found was beyond her wildest expectations. "Tony, you need to see this," she called to her partner, who was working on alien circuit boards in the next room. "I found bacteria living in chemical waste that should kill anything organic. Not just surviving, but thriving and actually breaking down the toxins into harmless compounds." Tony left his work and looked at Kate's samples under the microscope. What he saw were microscopic creatures that had adapted to live in environments that would instantly kill most life forms. They fed on pollution and turned poison into food in ways that seemed impossible. Earth's contamination created these, Kate explained with growing excitement in her voice. Decades of pollution forced life to evolve in ways that never happened on clean worlds. These organisms can survive in conditions that would kill any normal life form. As the alien purification continued, humans began to retreat deeper underground, into subway systems, abandoned mines, and natural caves that connected into vast networks beneath the Earth's surface. They discovered that the deeper they went, the less the alien atmosphere processors affected the air they breathed. But more importantly, they found that Earth's polluted environment had created something the aliens never expected. Life forms that could not just survive in hostile conditions, but actually required them to live. The bacteria that Kate discovered were just the beginning of adaptations that millions of years of environmental stress had created. Commander Zixthara stood in the pristine command center of his flagship and watched Earth's transformation with satisfaction. His sensors showed the atmosphere changing exactly as planned, while the temperature and pressure adjusted to match Valokian standards. Soon his people could walk on the surface without protective suits and breathe air as pure as that of their home world. But something was wrong, and he could not understand what it was. The purification process was working perfectly, but life on Earth was not dying as quickly as it should. In the most polluted areas, strange readings showed biological activity that made no sense according to Valokian science. The alien commander dismissed these readings as instrument errors because he could not imagine life forms that required pollution to survive. In his experience, all life needed clean air and pure water to exist. The idea that creatures could thrive in toxic waste was beyond his understanding of biology. As the 72nd hour approached and Earth's atmosphere continued its deadly transformation, humans prepared for a war unlike any in their history. They would fight not just for their cities or their countries, but for their right to exist on the world that had given them life, even as that world was being transformed into something alien and hostile. The battle for Earth was about to begin, and neither side truly understood what they were fighting for. 6 months after the Valokian invasion began the surface of Earth. looked like an alien world that bore no resemblance to the planet humans had called home for thousands of years. The atmosphere processors had done their work with terrible efficiency, turning the air into something that burned human lungs and made the sky glow with colors that had never existed in nature before. Most cities lay abandoned, while their former inhabitants lived like rats in the underground tunnels that had become humanity's last refuge. Captain Amy Rodriguez moved through the darkness of the old subway tunnel that connected Manhattan to Brooklyn, carrying supplies for the resistance fighters under her command. She had been a Marine before the invasion, but now she was something new entirely. The aliens had made her into a guerrilla fighter who knew every inch of the underground world that stretched beneath New York like the roots of a giant tree. Behind her followed 12 other survivors, including Dr. Ben Carter, who had once taught biology at Columbia University before the alien ships changed everything. He carried a backpack full of samples and instruments that he used to study the strange new ecosystem that was growing in Earth's most polluted places. What he had discovered in the past few months challenged everything humans thought they knew about life itself. "The readings are stronger here," he whispered to Amy, as they approached an area where toxic waste had been leaking into the groundwater for decades. "Whatever is living in this contamination is not just surviving, but actually multiplying at an incredible rate." Amy nodded and signaled for her team to spread out and take defensive positions. They had learned the hard way that Velokian patrol units sometimes ventured into the tunnel systems looking for human survivors. The aliens wore environmental suits that protected them from Earth's former pollution, but they moved awkwardly in the tight spaces underground where humans had the advantage. Above them, the surface world belonged entirely to the invaders now. Commander Zixthara had established his headquarters in what had once been Central Park, but was now a sterile landscape of crystalline formations that grew like cancer from the purified soil. His atmospheric processors continued their workday, and night transforming Earth into a copy of distant Velakar. But the alien commander was growing frustrated with problems he had never encountered on other conquered worlds. His ground forces reported equipment failures in areas where humans had dumped industrial waste for generations. Their bioneural technology began to malfunction when exposed to certain chemical combinations that existed nowhere else in the galaxy. On the bridge of the stellar dominion, Zixthara studied reports from his science teams with growing confusion. His sensors detected massive biological activity in places that should have been sterilized by the purification process. Lakes that had been poisoned by human industry now teemed with microscopic life forms that his instruments could not identify or classify. "Commander," reported his science officer Velfarian, who had spent days analyzing samples from Earth's most contaminated regions. "The biological readings make no sense according to our understanding of life sciences. These organisms appear to require toxic conditions to survive." Zixthara made a sound of disbelief because the idea seemed impossible. All life in the galaxy followed the same basic principles and needed clean environments to flourish. The notion that creatures could thrive in poison was contrary to everything Velokian science had discovered in thousands of years of exploration. "Run the tests again," he ordered with irritation clear in his voice. "Your instruments must be malfunctioning. No life form can survive in those chemical concentrations, much less reproduce in them." But deep beneath the Earth's surface, Dr. Ben Carter was documenting exactly that impossibility. In the flooded tunnels where industrial runoff had created pools of liquid that glowed with unnatural colors, he found ecosystems that operated by rules completely different from normal biology. Bacteria fed on heavy metals and excreted compounds that would kill any ordinary organism. Fungi grew in radioactive waste and actually concentrated the radiation until they glowed like living lanterns. "Look at this," he showed Amy a sample of water taken from a tunnel that had been flooded with chemical waste from a paint factory. Under his portable microscope, tiny creatures swam through the toxic soup like fish in a clear stream. These microorganisms are not just tolerating the pollution, but using it as their primary food source. Amy stared at the impossible sight and began to understand something that might change the course of the war. You mean Earth's contamination created new kinds of life? Exactly, Ben replied with excitement building in his voice. Millions of years of environmental stress forced evolution to find new solutions. The pollution that nearly destroyed our world also created adaptations that exist nowhere else in the galaxy. Meanwhile, in the abandoned subway system beneath, London Kate Miller and Tony Chun had made their own breakthrough in understanding Velokian technology. They had discovered that the alien bioneural circuits required extremely pure conditions to function properly. Even small amounts of chemical contamination caused the living components to malfunction and die. Their technology is like a hothouse. Flour, Kate explained as she showed Tony how exposure to ordinary human pollution caused alien circuits to break down at the cellular level. Beautiful and advanced, but completely unable to adapt to harsh conditions. Tony understood the implications immediately. While our technology was designed to work in polluted environments, because that is the world we created, our machines had to function despite contamination, while theirs fails the moment it encounters anything impure. Above-ground Velokian patrol. Units began reporting increasing equipment problems in areas that had once been industrial centers. Their weapons jammed when exposed to certain atmospheric conditions, and their communication systems failed near abandoned chemical plants. The aliens were forced to avoid the most polluted areas of Earth, which happened to be exactly where human resistance fighters had established their strongest bases. Commander, Zixthara received these reports with growing unease because they suggested something he did not want to believe. The planet killers were proving harder to eliminate than any species his empire had previously conquered. Unlike other races that died quickly when removed from their natural environment, humans seemed to become more dangerous when forced into hostile conditions. In the ruins of Detroit, Amy Rodriguez led a raid against a Velokian supply depot that had been established in what had once been an automotive factory. The building was surrounded by decades of industrial contamination. It made the alien soldiers sick even through their environmental suits. Human fighters moved through the toxic landscape like they belonged there, while their enemies stumbled and fell victim to equipment failures. The battle was brief but decisive. Humans used the environment itself as a weapon by leading aliens into areas where chemical fumes corroded their armor and electromagnetic fields from old power lines disrupted their bioneural systems. When the fighting ended, 12 Velokian soldiers lay dead while only 2 humans had been wounded. We are winning because this is our world, Amy told her fighters as they salvaged alien weapons and equipment from the battlefield. They made it clean and pretty, but we grew up in the mess, and we know how to use it. Dr. Ben Carter analyzed the captured Velokian equipment and found exactly what he expected. The bioneural components had been killed by exposure to industrial chemicals that humans encountered every day before the invasion. The aliens had created perfect technology for a perfect world, but Earth had never been perfect, and its people had learned to thrive in imperfection. News of the Detroit victory spread through the human resistance network like wildfire, carried by radio signals that bounced through abandoned subway tunnels and forgotten utility conduits. Similar victories were recorded from the ruins of industrial cities around the world as human fighters learned to use their polluted environment as an advantage rather than a handicap. But the most important discovery came from Dr. Ben Carter, who had been studying the ecosystem changes caused by the alien purification process. What he found challenged everything Commander Zixthara believed about life and death, and the relationship between species and their environment. The aliens are not just failing to kill us, he reported to the resistance leadership through encrypted Communications. They are creating conditions that favor the life forms Earth's pollution produced. Their purification process is actually helping our adapted organisms spread and multiply. The irony was almost too perfect to believe. By trying to clean up Earth's contamination, the aliens were inadvertently creating the perfect environment for pollution-adapted life forms to flourish. The planet killers were about to become something else entirely, and Commander Zixthara was beginning to suspect that he had made a terrible mistake in underestimating the species he had come to destroy. As the first year of occupation ended, Earth was transforming into something that neither humans nor aliens had expected. It was becoming a world where the most contaminated places had become gardens of impossible life, and the cleanest areas had turned into sterile wastelands. The war for humanity's survival was about to enter a new phase. It would challenge everything both sides thought they knew about life itself. 1 year after the Velokian invasion began, Dr. Lisa Barnes made a discovery that would change everything both sides understood about the war for Earth. She had been working in the deep underground laboratories beneath the Swiss mountains, analyzing samples of Velokian biological tissue taken from captured aliens. What she found in their cellular structure shocked her more than anything she had encountered in 30 years of studying alien life forms. "They have no genetic diversity," she announced to the emergency council meeting that included resistance leaders from around the world. Her voice carried a mixture of amazement and horror as she displayed her findings on the holographic screens. "Every Velokian soldier we have studied has essentially identical DNA patterns. They are not just similar, but literally genetic copies of each other." Colonel Ryan Hayes leaned forward in his chair, with confusion clear on his weathered face. "What does that mean for our fight against them?" Dr. Barnes manipulated the display to show cellular structures that looked more like manufactured components than natural biological tissue. "It means they evolved on a world so perfect and stable that they never needed genetic variation to survive. No diseases, no environmental challenges, no predators that required adaptation. They are essentially a single organism that has been copied millions of times." The implications hit everyone in the room like a physical blow. Captain Jake Morrison, who had survived his encounter with Commander Zixthara, spoke what they were all thinking. If they have no genetic diversity, then they have no ability to adapt to new conditions. They are like a computer program that can only run on one specific type of system. Meanwhile, in the polluted tunnels beneath New York, Amy Rodriguez was leading her resistance fighters through flooded subway systems that had become thriving ecosystems of impossible life. The toxic water that should have killed anything organic instead supported creatures that glowed with their own light and fed on the chemical contamination that had poisoned the tunnels for decades. Behind her, Dr. Ben Carter collected samples of the new organisms while marveling at how quickly they had spread through the underground waterways. In just 1 year, Earth's pollution-adapted life forms had created a hidden biosphere that connected continents through tunnel systems and underground rivers. "Look at this," he showed Amy a sample of bacteria that had learned to break down plastic waste and convert it into proteins that other organisms could eat. "These microbes are literally eating the garbage that humans left behind and turning it into food for an entire ecosystem." Above ground, the Velokian occupation forces were struggling with problems that Commander Zixthara could no longer ignore or explain away. His perfect bioneural technology continued to fail in areas where human pollution had been concentrated for generations. Worse, the purification process that should have sterilized Earth was instead creating conditions where unknown life forms multiplied at exponential rates. In his command center, above the ruins of what had once been the Amazon rainforest, Zixthara studied reports from his science teams with growing alarm. The atmospheric processors were working exactly as designed, but the results were completely different from what they had achieved on other conquered worlds. "Commander," reported his chief, Scientist Valfarian with uncertainty in his musical voice. The biological readings from the underground systems suggest we are dealing with life forms that operate by principles unknown to Velokian science. They appear to require contaminated environments to survive and reproduce. Zixthara stared at the data streams with growing frustration because everything he was seeing contradicted what he knew about biology and evolution. In his experience, all life followed the same universal patterns and needed clean, stable environments to flourish. The idea that organisms could thrive in toxic waste was like claiming that fire needed ice to burn. But thousands of miles away, in the ruins of an old chemical plant outside Detroit human saboteur Danny, Walsh was preparing to demonstrate exactly how wrong the alien commander had become. Danny had spent months studying captured Velokian equipment and learning how their bioneural systems responded to different types of contamination. His team had gathered samples of industrial chemicals that had been banned on Earth for decades because of their toxicity to human life. But Danny had discovered that these same chemicals were absolutely lethal to Velokian bioneural tissue. A few drops of certain compounds could cause their entire technological system to collapse like a house of cards. Remember, he told his team of 12 volunteers as they prepared for their mission against a Velokian supply depot. We are not trying to outfight them with superior weapons. We are using their perfection against them by introducing chaos into their ordered systems. The attack began at dawn when human fighters emerged from the polluted wasteland that surrounded the abandoned chemical plant like ghosts rising from poisoned ground. They moved through clouds of toxic vapor that would have killed them before. Their bodies adapted to Earth's contaminated environment over generations of exposure. The Velokian guards never had a chance to sound an alarm because their environmental suits began failing the moment they encountered the concentrated chemical contamination that Danny's team had weaponized. Their bioneural weapons shut down their communication systems, went dead, and their perfect armor became a tomb that trapped them in a hostile environment their biology could not handle. Within minutes, the supply depot was in human hands alone, with tons of alien equipment that would be studied and reverse engineered by resistant scientists. But more importantly, Danny had proven that Velokian technology was not invincible, but was actually vulnerable to the very pollution that humans had learned to survive. News of the victory spread through the resistance network faster than wildfire, and similar attacks began occurring around the world. In the ruins of industrial cities, human fighters used decades of accumulated contamination as weapons against an enemy whose perfection had become their greatest weakness. But the most significant discovery came when Dr. Ben Carter analyzed tissue samples from Velokian soldiers who had died during the chemical attacks. What he found confirmed Dr. Barnes' earlier research, but revealed something even more disturbing about the alien invaders. They are dying from exposure to conditions that barely affect adapted humans, he reported through encrypted communications to resistance leaders worldwide. Their cellular structure cannot process toxins that human cells neutralize automatically after generations of environmental exposure. The implications were staggering. Earth's pollution had not just created new life forms, but had also forced existing life, including humans, to develop resistance to conditions that would kill species from clean worlds. The planet killers had accidentally made themselves into the most environmentally adaptable species in the galaxy. Commander Zixthara received reports of the increasing casualties among his ground forces with shock that quickly turned to something he had never experienced before in his 3 centuries of military service. For the first time in Velokian history, his forces were losing ground to a supposedly inferior species, and he could not understand how it was happening. In desperation, he ordered his atmospheric processors to increase their purification rate, hoping that complete sterilization of Earth's environment would eliminate the mysterious life forms that seemed to thrive in contaminated conditions. But the results were exactly opposite to what he expected, the more his machines cleaned. Earth's atmosphere, the more space they created for pollution, adapted organisms to expand and multiply. Areas that had been completely sterilized by the purification process became breeding grounds for bacteria and fungi that had evolved to colonize hostile environments in the deep tunnels beneath. London Kate Miller made a discovery that explained what was happening to Earth's biosphere. She had been tracking the spread of new organisms through the underground waterways and found that they were not random mutations, but part of a coordinated evolutionary response to environmental pressure. The contamination did not just create isolated species, she explained to Tony Chun as they watched bioluminescent fungi spread across the walls of a flooded tunnel. It forced life to develop cooperative relationships that allowed different organisms to survive together in conditions that would kill them individually. Tony understood immediately what she was describing. Like the bacteria that break down toxins to feed the fungi that neutralize radiation to help the plants that produce oxygen for the fish, they created an ecosystem that turns poison into a food chain. Above ground, Maria Santos led urban warfare specialists through the ruins of Mexico City, where decades of air pollution had created atmospheric conditions that were toxic to Velokian respiratory systems. Human fighters moved through smog clouds that their lungs had adapted to process, while alien soldiers suffocated despite their environmental protection. The battle for the city lasted 3 days and ended with complete human victory, not because they had better weapons or superior numbers, but because they were fighting on ground that had been shaped by their own environmental mistakes. The pollution that had once threatened to destroy human civilization had become the key to its survival. 2 years after the invasion began, Commander Zixthara stood in what had once been his pristine command center and stared at reports that shattered everything he believed about conquest and survival. Half of his ground forces were dead or dying from exposure to Earth's contaminated environment, while human resistance fighters controlled most of the planet's former industrial zones. His perfect bioneural technology lay in ruins, contaminated by chemicals that humans breathed like air. The alien commander had called an emergency meeting with his senior officers, but the discussion had devolved into something that resembled panic more than military planning. For the first time in Velokian history, an invasion force was facing complete defeat at the hands of a species they had dismissed as primitives. "Commander," reported his chief medical officer Silandra, with fear clear in her musical voice, "we have lost contact with 37 ground units in the past week alone. The atmospheric contamination in former human industrial zones is proving lethal to our personnel, despite full environmental protection." Zixthara made a sound of frustration. That would have been impossible for his throat to produce before coming to this cursed world. The stress of fighting an impossible war was changing him in ways that frightened his subordinates, who had never seen the perfect commander show weakness. Meanwhile, in the tunnels beneath what had once been Chicago, Dr. Sam Foster sat in chains, inside a makeshift prison cell carved from the concrete walls of an abandoned subway station. He had been captured 3 days earlier while collecting biological samples from a polluted underground lake, and now found himself face to face with the alien commander who had ordered the extermination of his species. Zixthara entered the cell, wearing an environmental suit that hissed and wheezed as its filters struggled to process the contaminated air of the human underground. Through the transparent faceplate, Dr. Foster could see green-scaled skin that looked paler and more sickly than it should have according to the propaganda broadcasts the aliens had transmitted during the early days of their occupation. "You are Dr. Sam Foster," the alien commander said in English. That carried the musical accent of his species, but was colored with exhaustion that made his voice sound almost human. "You have studied our technology and our biology. I want to understand how your species has survived What should have killed you? Dr. Foster looked at his captor with the calm expression of a man who had already accepted his probable death. He was 50 years old with gray hair and wore the simple clothes of someone who had spent 2 years living in underground tunnels. But his eyes held the intelligence that had made him one of Earth's leading experts on extremophile organisms before. The war began. You want to understand how we survived, he repeated with something that might have been amusement in his voice. The answer is simple, Commander. We survived because this world tried to kill us long before you arrived. Zixthara moved closer to the cell bars with confusion clear in his body language. Explain what you mean by that statement. Dr. Foster settled back against the concrete wall and began to speak in the tone of a professor, addressing students who were struggling with a difficult concept. For thousands of years, my species lived in harmony with our environment just like yours did. But then we discovered fire and tools and agriculture, and we began to change the world around us. The alien commander listened with growing attention as the human continued his explanation. At first, the changes were small and manageable, but as our population grew and our technology advanced, we began to alter Earth's atmosphere and oceans and climate in ways that threatened all life, including our own. We poisoned our air with industrial chemicals. We filled our water with toxic waste. We changed the very composition of our atmosphere through the burning of fossil fuels. Zixthara interrupted with the contempt that had driven him to order humanity's extinction. Yes, I have seen the evidence of your species' stupidity. You destroyed the very world that gave you life. But Dr. Foster smiled with an expression that held no humor at all. We almost did, Commander, but almost is the key word in that sentence. Because while we were busy destroying our environment, we were also learning how to survive in the toxic world we had created. The human scientist stood up and walked closer to the cell bars so that he could look directly into the alien's eyes through his environmental suit. Every generation of humans was exposed to slightly higher levels of contamination than the one before. Our bodies adapted to process chemicals that would kill any organism from a clean world. Our lungs learned to filter toxins from polluted air. Our digestive systems developed the ability to neutralize poisons that would be instantly lethal to species like yours. Zixthara felt something cold growing in his chest as he began to understand the implications of what the human was saying. You are claiming that your environmental destruction made you stronger. Not stronger, Commander, but more adaptable. Earth's contamination forced us to evolve in ways that would never happen on a perfect world like yours. We became a species that could survive in hostile environments because we had no choice but to learn or die. Dr. Foster paused and looked around the polluted tunnel that had become his prison. Bioluminescent organisms grew on the walls like living stars, while bacteria converted toxic chemicals into harmless compounds in the contaminated water that flowed through channels cut in the concrete floor. But here is the part you never understood. He continued with growing intensity in his voice. We did not just learn to survive in our poisoned world. We learned to heal it. The alien commander made a sound of disbelief because nothing he had seen in his study of human history suggested that the planet killers had ever tried to repair the damage they had caused. Dr. Foster seemed to read his thoughts and nodded toward the living ecosystem that filled the abandoned subway tunnel. Look around you, Commander. This tunnel was flooded with industrial waste that killed everything that lived here. But now it supports dozens of species that feed on contamination and turn poison into food for other organisms. Zixthara looked more closely at what he had dismissed as random biological activity and began to see patterns that suggested something far more complex than simple adaptation. The organisms were not just surviving in the toxic environment, but were actively cleaning it while creating conditions that allowed other life forms to flourish. We did not abandon our polluted world, Dr. Foster explained as understanding began to dawn in the aliens' eyes. We learned to work with it. We developed bacteria that could eat plastic waste and convert it into nutrients. We created plants that could absorb heavy metals from contaminated soil and concentrate them for safe disposal. We engineered organisms that could break down chemical toxins and render them harmless. The human scientist walked back to his makeshift bed and sat down with the tired movements of someone who had spent too long living underground. What you saw as evidence of our stupidity was actually evidence of our greatest strength. We made terrible mistakes, but we also learned how to fix them. Zixthara left the cell without another word and returned to his command center with thoughts that refused to organize themselves into the ordered patterns he had known all his life. For hours he stood before the great windows that looked out over Earth's transformed landscape and tried to understand what the human prisoner had tried to explain out above ground. The atmospheric processors continued their work of purification, but the results were nothing like what they had achieved on other conquered worlds. Instead of creating the sterile paradise of Velikar, they had produced something that defied all logic and classification. In areas where the machines had completely sterilized the environment, nothing grew except crystalline formations that looked beautiful but supported no life at all. But in places where traces of human contamination remained, incredible ecosystems flourished with organisms that turned the remnants of pollution into the foundation for new kinds of biological communities. The alien commander activated his communication system and called for his science officer Valtharian, who arrived within minutes wearing the expression of someone who had been struggling with impossible data for too long. Commander, I have been analyzing the biological readings from across the planet, and I must report findings that contradict everything we know about ecology and evolution, the scientist said with confusion clear in his voice. Zixthara gestured for him to continue, even though he suspected he already knew what the report would contain. The areas we have successfully purified are becoming biological deserts that cannot support any form of life. Valtharian explained while displaying holographic images of sterile landscapes that looked like the surface of a dead moon. But the regions where human contamination persists are developing into ecosystems more complex and diverse than anything we have encountered in our exploration of the galaxy. The alien commander studied the images with growing comprehension of a truth that challenged the fundamental beliefs of his entire civilization. You are saying that the pollution is necessary for these life forms to exist.